Last week we looked at what it was like to dine aboard the Lusitania, the ocean liner that was sunk by a German torpedo during World War I. Well, this week I'm going to look at what the men in the U-boat that actually fired that torpedo were eating. Perhaps something like this 1915 German recipe for sauerkraut soup. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we dive and dine in a World War I U-boat, this time on Tasting History. There are numerous cookbooks from Germany written during World War I that are filled with recipes specifically for wartime. Many were written for those on the home front, others for those in the trenches, and while I couldn't find one specifically written for the Imperial Navy, I thought that this cookbook, Kriegskochbuch or War Cookbook, would fit the brief. Especially because it was published in 1915, which was the year that Lusitania was sunk. And since it was published fairly early on in the war started in 1914, it's before the really terrible food shortages hit Germany. That said, the recipes in it are still rather basic, and so many of them would only include ingredients that you could find on a German U-boat, like this recipe for Sauerkrautsuppe, which actually just says to follow the previous recipe for pickle soup, but use sauerkraut. So subbing sauerkraut for pickles, the recipe says the fat and flour are whisked and the water is slowly added. When the soup has simmered, the sauerkraut is added. Salt and vinegar are added to the soup and seasoned. Very basic. Now, what's a little frustrating is while the recipe gives exact amounts for the water, for the fat, or we're going to use butter, and the flour, it doesn't tell you exactly how much sauerkraut to use, so we're going to just kind of have to guess at that, and that's kind of an issue with a lot of old recipes. They tend to leave out some very important things. Not an issue with the well-written recipes from today's sponsor, HelloFresh. HelloFresh delivers fresh ingredients right to your door so you can easily follow their chef-crafted recipes. And with 45 weekly recipes, there is something for everyone. And I love that all of the ingredients arrive pre-portioned so you don't have to worry about a lot of prep work, and there's no question about how much of an ingredient to actually use. Also, it makes it so there are no leftover ingredients that are just going to go bad sitting in your fridge. I particularly enjoy their line of quick and easy meals for the chef who doesn't have a lot of time on their hands, like this recipe for pork sausage rigatoni rosa, easy to prepare and absolutely delicious. Especially when you follow it up with dessert, though I actually ate my Lemonberry Bun Cake this morning for breakfast, and I am not going to apologize for that. And right now, when you sign up for HelloFresh using my link in the description and use code TASTINGHISTORYSWEET, you will get free dessert for life. That is one free dessert in every box while your subscription is active. So Tasting History Sweet at HelloFresh.com for free dessert for life. I definitely recommend that Lemonberry Bun Cake. It really was quite good. Now, unfortunately, they did not have Lemonberry Bun Cake aboard a German U-boat during World War I, so if you want to eat like they did, then what you're going to need is 2 tablespoons of butter or other fat, 4 tablespoons or 30 grams of flour, 1.5 liters of water, 1 to 2 tablespoons of vinegar, some salt, and 2 to 3 cups of sauerkraut. Like I said, they didn't tell you how much sauerkraut to use, so I'm using quite a bit because otherwise it's really just thickened water, but it's kind of up to you and probably dependent on what period of the war you're in. Now, they would have had all of these ingredients aboard a U-boat, at least at the beginning of any mission, because over time, many of the perishable ingredients would go bad, and so they wouldn't have those for much of the mission. But let's pretend we're at the beginning of a voyage, and we still have butter. So the first thing you want to do is melt that butter. The recipe actually doesn't specify butter, it just says fat, but they did often have butter aboard the ship, so that's what I'm using. So once it's melted, add the flour and whisk it together. You're essentially making a roux here. Though typically a roux is a 1-to-1 ratio, this is a 1-to-2 ratio, basically half the fat as usual. And the only thing I can think is that even at the beginning of the war, they were rationing things like butter, so maybe that's what makes this a wartime cookbook. Either way, keep whisking it together for 3 or 4 minutes or until it turns a golden brown. Then slowly add the water, whisking to get the roux to dissolve. Once it's all dissolved into the water, let it come to a simmer, and once simmering, add in the sauerkraut. Stir it all together, and then let it return to a simmer. And let it simmer for about 15 minutes, which should be plenty of time to go back to 1915 and see what other kind of provisions they would have on a German U-boat. During World War I, German U-boats, which stands for Unterseeboot, or undersea boats, were rather varied and evolved quite a bit in the 4 years of conflict. In 1914, they only had 20 working subs, most of which were powered by kerosene, but by the end of the war, they had made over 350 diesel-powered U-boats. They still had a lot of variation, but an average vessel like U-20, the U-boat that sank the Lusitania, was 210 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 27 feet tall. Now with a crew of 36, you would think that that's plenty of room for everyone on the boat, but it turns out most of the space is not actually livable. A fair amount of the space is given over to large tanks that would flood with seawater when diving, and then the ends of the boat were home to the torpedoes. There were 7 torpedoes in all that would shoot from 2 tubes at the bow and 2 at the stern. Then there was the engine room, which had 2 850 horsepower diesel engines and tanks for 76 tons of diesel fuel, and 2 600 horsepower electric engines with massive batteries, which were used when the U-boat was submerged. This left precious little room for actual living. There was, of course, the captain's quarters, and then the control room, and then there was a small area for the wireless operator and bunks for all of the crew. And almost as an afterthought, there was a rather small kitchen and 2 mess areas, one for the crew and one for the officers. The question is, where does the food that's going to get cooked in that kitchen actually get stored? And the answer is everywhere. Before leaving Germany, a U-boat was laden down with sausages, fresh meat, potatoes, flour, eggs, butter, milk, coffee, sugar, tea, salted fish, peas, bacon, and a lot of canned meat, vegetables, and fruits and bread. It was stuffed under bunks, hung from pipes overhead, stuffed in the latrine, or if it was perishable, like the vegetables and milk, it would actually be kept in the ammunition room, because that room they wisely kept much cooler than the rest of the sub. Unfortunately, while that might work in the North Sea, in the Mediterranean and the Adriatic, even that room just was not cool enough, so they didn't get to carry around a lot of the prized ingredients. In the heat of summer, carrying meat with us was out of the question. That made eggs all the more desirable. Once we had no eggs for a whole month, and vegetables and macaroni were our most substantial dishes. Now, a crew of fighting men need better food than that. And even in the cold of the North Sea, you would only have those perishable goods for the first 10 days of any mission. After that, they would usually go bad. So the vast majority of the food on board was pickled or dried or canned. And even some of those more shelf-stable foods would not fare very well on a submarine, because in a submarine, it was like a tropical jungle. The temperature could get up to 100 degrees, and it was very poorly ventilated. This was especially bad when the boat was submerged, which it didn't spend that much time typically underwater, but it didn't take very long to get all sweaty and gross in there, especially because the heat on the inside of the sub and the cold water on the outside of the sub would kind of hit each other and form condensation all on the walls of the inside of the sub, which they called U-boat sweat. This created the perfect conditions for mold. Mold was on their clothes, it was on their blankets, in their shoes, and of course, it would grow on their food. Add to this the fact that even with the ventilation, there was always a little bit of diesel fumes inside of the sub, and that would mix with the condensation and create little oil slicks on the top of their soup and their coffee, and that's gross, and I'm not going to be doing that for today's soup. No oil. So 10 days into what was typically a month-long patrol, and they were starting to run out of all the good food, and their other food would have like oil and mold on it. You'd think these people would go mad. Well, in 1928, the author Lowell Thomas interviewed a number of officers from different U-boats and put their thoughts down in a book called Raiders of the Deep. And in there, the commander of U-64 says, "Food, that is always the great problem in a submarine. On a long voyage, that interminable diet of canned stuff with peas and bacon as the pièce de résistance becomes unbearable. Since then, I've never been able to look at a pea in the face. As for the bacon, on that point I'll be a Mohammedan to the end of my days." Though sometimes, even if the food was nothing to write home about, the meal itself was worth being remembered, as Lieutenant Rudolf Zentner recalled of his first Christmas at war aboard U-20, which was the U-boat that sunk the Lusitania. The tiny mess room was decorated in style. A green wreath hung at one end as a Christmas tree. We didn't have any lighted candles on it. They would have been too risky in the oil-reeking interior of a submarine. The tables were loaded with food. It all came out of cans, but we didn't mind that. That one night, officers and men had their mess together. It was rather close quarters. We had a crew of 4 officers and 32 men. We were all in our leather submarine suits. It was no dress affair, no stiff bosoms, no coattails, no fish and soup, as you call them. In short, there were many drawbacks, but good spirits were not one of them. In the tight, overcrowded little mess room, we ate and talked. The dinner was washed down with tea mixed with rum, and I lost count of the number of toasts that were drunk. But sadly, every day can't be Christmas. So most of the time, when the food was crummy, so was the crew. And so it was up to the crew to figure out other ways to get quality food on board their boat. U-19, after a long cruise in the North Sea, came upon one of the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland. This island was known to be uninhabited by people, but chock full of goats. So a party went ashore with rifles. The hunt for wild goats was a thing to delight a sportsman's heart. They accumulated a good buck and returned to the boat. That day there was a magnificent feast of roast goat aboard a U-boat in the subarctic. But there are only so many goat-filled islands to go hunting on, so more often the U-boats had to rely on the spoils of war. Especially following the sinking of the Lusitania and a promise to allow crews off their ships before they sunk, U-boats would plunder merchant ships for whatever food they had before sinking the ship. This would often lead to their pantries full to bursting, but that would make it difficult to control the men. It used to be no uncommon sight to see sailors of the submarine service going home on leave loaded down with parcels of sugar, bacon, ham, and so on, which represented stuff taken from prizes. Very welcome presents for their families, which were bearing the rigors of Germany's wartime shortage. The men would often get to enjoy the spoils of war, but this was only after the officers had taken their fair share. Robert Morat, who was the commander of U-64, used to usually dine in the officers' mess, but when there were special ingredients coming aboard, he would test them out in his room. There would be a cloth spread on my desk while Haupt brought me coffee, hard bread, marmalade, and a pancake baked on the electric stove. The marmalade was a luxury. I remember to this day a heaven-sent ship that I sunk on which we found enough marmalade to last for 6 months. No, I shall never forget that ship. This same commander had a lot to say about the food on the U-boat, as well as the cook on the U-boat, a man named Midtank. And he says that had Midtank had quality ingredients, he probably would have been a fine cook, but as it was, his food was not very good because of the ingredients. And the men would make fun of Midtank for this, but Midtank was very sensitive and would take it to heart, and so he was always threatening to get a transfer to another U-boat where he would be appreciated. And so the commander would have to give him all of these false compliments just to calm him down. He'd say, "Midtank, you ought to see what I wrote to my wife this morning. I told her that those pancakes you cooked for me were absolutely delicious. And I told her also that there never was such bacon and peas as you make." He says on one occasion the cook was so upset that the only way to placate him was to promise him the opportunity to earn an Iron Cross, the medal that the military gave out. But that was typically for combat stuff, not for cooking. So one day, when they were having a firefight on deck, he had Midtank taking ammunition up and down the stairs, and he did so for quite some time and with some aplomb, and so he used that as a pretext to put him in for an Iron Cross, which he got. So the cook aboard the U-boat got an Iron Cross. Now, while it was always the goal to plunder these ships for the choicest ingredients before actually sinking them, it wasn't always practical. As Lieutenant Zentner explained, a U-boat cannot always venture to send a boarding crew on a prize and snatch a bit of fresh meat and vegetables. We had to content ourselves with canned stuff, dried stuff, and hardtack, and on long cruises the fare sometimes became intolerable. I remember one occasion when we became positively desperate for a decent bite to eat. We managed to capture a fine hogshead of butter. For a couple days, we piled butter on our hardtack and thought it delicious. Everybody said that the butter would do well for cooking, only we didn't have anything decent to cook with it. The sailors positively sang a chorus of, "If only we had something to fry in the butter." Well, as nice as it is to spread a bunch of butter on hardkeks, the German word for hardtack, they were definitely on the scout for something to cook in this butter, and so they happened upon some French fishing boats, and they submerged and went in between the boats, and then they surfaced. And Lieutenant Zentner says that the fishermen probably thought that they were about to be killed, but then started laughing and cheering when they found out that the only thing the Germans wanted was some of their fish. "We crammed our boat with fish, fine big fellows, bonitos with a pinkish meat. And now there was fresh fish, fried in butter, grilled in butter, sautéed in butter, all that we could eat." Now, it wasn't just fish and butter that they were bringing aboard their U-boats, because after they made this promise to allow the passengers and crew of merchant ships to get off into their lifeboats before blowing up the ship, they would often have to take some of these passengers and crew onto the U-boat, because if they were out in the middle of the Atlantic, they couldn't just leave them out there. Now, I'm sure there was a lot of variation in how these people were treated, usually as prisoners, but there are some stories of, like, one German cook on a U-boat made a little girl a cake with some canned fruit and whipped cream, and then there was an American boat that was sunk, and the man who came aboard the U-boat ended up writing about his experience. Their food was good. In the morning we had rolls and fresh butter. The butter was fine. The bread was black and came in loaves about 3 feet long. We had cognac nearly all the time. The members of the crew were cheerful and joked with us, especially after indulging in cognac. They were apparently young fellows and frequently talked of their mothers. And it wasn't just people on these U-boats, but animals too. U-20 actually saved a black dachshund named Maria from one of the boats that they sank and brought her on board. The issue was that they already had another dog on board who was a male, and very soon dear Maria was pregnant and gave birth to 4 puppies, and that was just too many dogs on one boat, so they gave 3 of them to other U-boats. But still, 3 dogs on one U-boat, that's a lot of mouths to feed. And while I'm not sure what the dogs ate, the monkeys ate eggs and bananas. Yes, there was a monkey on a U-boat. Her name was Phipps, and she was notorious for sneaking into the kitchen and stealing eggs while the cook's back was turned. She was Lothar von Arnold's monkey aboard U-35, the most successful U-boat in the war. This U-boat sank 220 merchant vessels during the war, and one of those was an Italian steamer that was chock full of bananas. As the vessel went down, hundreds of bananas floated on the surface. The dinghy went out and collected a boatload. We spread the bananas out to ripen a bit in the hot Mediterranean sun. We managed to gorge ourselves with bananas. Nothing like Phipps, though. The yellow fruit seemed to remind her of her tropical home. She leaped, chattered, and shrieked with delight, and ate more bananas than I thought her small body would contain. A monkey eating bananas, how predictable. Luckily, I don't think monkeys eat sauerkraut, so the sauerkraut soup would at least be safe aboard a U-boat, and it should be ready to finish off here in my kitchen. So after the sauerkraut has simmered for 15 minutes, add a tablespoon of white wine vinegar and a teaspoon of salt. Then stir it in and give it a taste to see if it needs any more of either, and then serve. And here we are, German sauerkraut soup from World War I. Now I'm going to eat this with some Schwarzbrot, or black bread. It's a bread that was very popular on the U-boats. It's made of dark rye. They would often actually have it canned, but sometimes they would have fresh loaves, especially at the beginning of a voyage. So I'm going to have a little bit of that. But first, I'm going to just try the soup as it is. It smells like sauerkraut. I don't know what I was expecting. Tastes like sauerkraut soup, which is what it is. I mean, the sauerkraut is definitely the flavor that you're getting. There's not a lot else to get. It's just water and roux, a little salt and vinegar. But if you like sauerkraut, it's a nice way of eating it. And I'm guessing if you really hadn't had much else, it would be quite delicious. There's not a lot else there, so it's not a very complicated flavor. except that sauerkraut is kind of a complicated flavor in and of itself. But try it with some of this black bread, Schwarzbrot. Actually, that's quite good. That's quite good. That bread is delicious. It's not as dark as pumpernickel, which is another rye, and so it's not quite as rye-y, rye forward. I really like that bread, and with the kind of sourness, the acidity from the soup, they kind of balance each other out. So I think that that would actually be a pretty good meal, and maybe, like they were saying, you could have it with some tea and rum, I believe was what they drank that one Christmas. Yeah, it's really easy, so there's not any reason that you shouldn't try it if you like sauerkraut. If you don't like sauerkraut, just swap out the sauerkraut for a big old pickle, and then you're making the pickle soup, which they mentioned. Everything else stays exactly the same. You could also do it with a head of cabbage. That's another recipe in there. Also with beets, that's another recipe in there. They're all pretty much the same, just swapping out the vegetables. So yeah, that is food from World War I that might have been served on a German U-boat. And if you want to see more wartime recipes from World War I or World War II, let me know what you want to see in the comments. I've got a few things planned, but I'm always looking for ideas, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.